Thanks, Pastor Seth. One of my favorite stories about Pastor Seth is we were in a class. It was an intensive class, which means we cram a whole lot of content and relationships and connection into 1 week. And I had given a prompt to the class that I thought was a really good one. That was going to capture them, and they were going to have to think about it and process it. And then, of course, I would jam up the time that they had to do it, so they had to think fast. And I was like, this is one that's going to get their attention. It's going to force them to think, and it's going to force them to think fast, and then it will generate discussion. Well, I offered the prompt, I gave the time, I said, time's up, and I invited some feedback. Pastor Seth puts up his hand, and I was like, yeah, all right, share what you got. And he rhymes off over the next 30 seconds a perfect answer that required nothing else added to it, and nothing could be taken away from it to the question. It completely destroyed the exercise. It's like, yeah, I guess there's nothing else to say. Like anybody else would say something, and if they're right, they're just going to say what he already said, and if they say anything else, they're going to be wrong. So, all right, break time. Thanks so much, Pastor Seth, for the invitation. It really is good to be with you and to be with this local body in the season of Advent. Advent, of course, means arrival, and we are in the midst of preparing for arrival. And this week we are talking about peace. 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 Talking about peace, then, it's a little bit strange that this would be the title slide for the sermon. Peace in a war zone. I remember you're like, what war zone do we have in mind? Maybe your mind goes ahead and you're thinking of like strewn about papers and wrappings and tinsel and ribbons, discarded boxes, and maybe a present or two that was given that nobody really wanted, that is just kind of strewn about in the living room or the space wherever you're going to have Christmas. Like that can feel like a bit of a war zone. Maybe your mind goes to later on Christmas Day or the day after, maybe sometime in the festivities. Maybe it goes back a few weeks ago to Thanksgiving when you had people that were together that sometimes don't spend all this time together, and there's some unwritten rules about what you talk about and what you don't talk about, and somebody broke those unwritten rules. Somebody engaged a conversation that no one else really wanted to have, and it kind of felt like an emotional war zone, like things just got blown up. Maybe our minds, because of just the contemporary events that are happening, our minds go to places where there literally is war. Ukraine and Russia and Israel and Palestine, these places and the images that come to us so fast and furious. Peace in a war zone. Now, if you were to answer, or war zone comes to mind for any one of these things, they all can be implicated in what we're going to talk about, and yet none of them captures exactly the war zone that I've got in mind. The peace that we'll talk about has implications for all of them. But first, to understand the peace that we can claim and expect and yearn for and ask for through Advent, we look at the description of a war zone from Revelation chapter 12. In Advent, we are preparing for 3 comings of Christ. Advent really is a season of preparation. That's why we take Sundays before to get ready for Christmas Day. Now, there are 3 comings of Christ that we think about. First, we think about his coming in history, in humility and weakness, subject to all the needs that an infant brings, pushed down and powerless as a political group, as his Jewish people are oppressed by the Romans. We think of that coming, and we celebrate it. We also prepare for the second coming of Christ, when Christ comes in power and glory to wrap all of this up, to bring finality, to bring full revelation of what he has started at the end of history. 3 comings of Christ that we are preparing for. That's what Advent is about. So what's this got to do with peace in a war zone? What is thinking about these 3 comings of Christ in history, at Christmas time, anticipated at the end of the world, and the war zone that might even describe not just parts of our world, but even aspects of our lives? How do these all fit together? Well, to get at that answer, let's look into the book of Revelation. Let's look into the book of Revelation. We're going to start at chapter 12. Now, one of the temptations about Revelation is to try to read it as a secret code. To read it as a secret code that you need to decipher and that you need to get into, and you need to kind of like figure out what the mystery of it is that is really tough to figure out. But I don't think that's what Revelation actually is. Revelation is a letter that was sent to 7 different churches and were scattered around what's now parts of Europe. And it was scattered around to these 7 different churches, not so that they would be confused, but so that there would be clarity. Not so that they would be overwhelmed, but so that they would be encouraged. And this is one of the stories that John writes about in this letter that's sent to 7 different churches. Revelation chapter 12, and it starts like this. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Now already we know that we are into some kind of story that is packed with a meaning that is embedded within it. Not as a secret code, but using symbolism. It's a sign. It's something that's to communicate something else. John uses language that the readers would be familiar with to describe Israel. If you're familiar with the story of Joseph, and he describes the sun and the moon bowing down to him, and the 12 stars and the 12 tribes of Israel, he's picked up this imagery that communicates to his readers or his hearers that this woman here is Israel. And she is pregnant and cries out in pain and is about to give birth. Of course, the story of Christ. Verse 3. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. This notion of heads and horns and crowns communicates the strength and wisdom and authority of this dragon. And then you see it put into play whenever these stars, it's a sign or it's a symbol of angels that are also dragged down with his work. Now, in a moment, John is going to tell us that this dragon is actually the devil, the great serpent or Satan. And we see the full wisdom, the insight that the devil has, the power and the authority, such that he is even able to mislead angels. But notice where all of his anxious threat or anxious worry is placed. It's placed in the child that's about to be born. And so we have this story that is compelling us to see the anxious worry of the devil, the confrontation that's about to take place between this dragon and this child that's about to be born. Verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So now the story is moving forward. The child is born, and yet is preserved, is kept safe. The child is born and lives out his life, is taken up to God in the ascension, as the story of Christ goes. And the woman is now sent into the wilderness. Now we have a shift in who the woman is. It's not simply Israel. Now it's communicating something else. The people of God who have now gone into the wilderness, or a desert, or a dry place, or a barren place, or wilderness, yet where God will care for them. Verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Now notice how John has shifted the context of the story. First, it was this heavenly concern mingled with earth. Right? The heavenly concern of the enemy, the dragon, worried about the child who is to be born. And then John shifts our attention back up into heaven, where there is this great conflict between the devil and Michael the archangel. The work of Christ guarantees the victory of heaven, and it throws the enemy down. You see that he is thrown down to earth. So it's like we have this perspective of a story from the heavens to the earth, back to the heavens, and then back to earth again, where he was hurled down, the enemy with his angels with him. Skip down to verse 13. When the enemy, or the dragon, saw that he had been hurled to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she might be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 years, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now again, we can read that, and it's odd to us. It's strange to us. It's different from a lot of literature that we often engage with. And yet if you just see the movements of the story, you see a very clear story. You've got this dragon who is filled with authority and wisdom, and yet is one who is working against the powers and work of God. He is worried about the birth of this child who will come through the people of Israel. And as a result, comes to try and devour him, but he is unable to do so, right? The hero of the story is able to complete his work. The hero's completed work results in the enemy or the dragon or the serpent or the devil's casting out of heaven to earth. And John says, now it is like a war zone here. He is enraged, and he wants to take it out on all the offspring of the woman, or the church and all who would follow after her. That's the general flow of the story. Sometimes my children will get into a conflict, which is not always all that serious, but it's very serious to them. And of course, being the father that I am, after I set aside what it is that I'm doing, I'll try and go and attend to them. Any other dads that get called into the mix whenever there's a conflict with the children? Moms get called into the conflict, right? You go in to try and sort it out. And here's one of the things I've learned how to say, because all of them are very good at telling a story, right? They're always very good at telling a story, giving all the context, giving all the ins and outs and ups and downs and backwards and forwards of why they are in the right. They are very good at telling a story. So what I say to them is, I don't want to hear a story. I just want to hear the facts. I just want to hear what happened. Anybody else ever say that? All right. What John has given to us here is a story to describe what reality is, to describe the reality of the people to whom he's writing. But it's not just a story. It's the story, just from a different or even hidden perspective. John has described the work and story of Israel and Jesus and then into the church from a perspective that is otherwise hidden to them. He's not just telling them a story that he has made up. He is telling them the story from a different perspective or from a hidden perspective. Here's how it continues. I saw a beast, and the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had, listen to it, it's the same as the dragon, 10 horns and 7 heads, and now 10 crowns on his horns, and on each of them a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and the throne and great authority. What's going on is John is continuing on the story, right? Behind all of these beastly reigns, which John has picked up from another book called Daniel, and they represent real authorities in history. He's saying that behind all of those conflicts and injustice and misguided authority, behind all that is the enemy. He's the one that is giving authority that just starts to run rampant in our world. John is describing their world. The hidden perspective or the unseen perspective starts to play it out in all of their lives, he's saying. Verse 3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound that had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed this beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Listen carefully to this question. Who can make war against him? Put yourself back into the first century and you see misguided authority and abusive authority and those who are in charge, who are doing things they're not supposed to do, who are not making things good and right and beneficial for the people, but who are making their lives worse, who are making and filling their lives with violence, who are holding power over them, who are threatening their very existence. John is describing those people's lives. Behind it all is the dragon, the serpent, the enemy. But it gets lived out through these beastly reigns that they know, that they can see. And then he's got this parody, this one who's got a wound that seems to be fatal but actually has been healed. John is describing one who is like Christ but is not Christ, because Christ is one who was sacrificed as a lamb who was then raised eternally. What is John doing? He's telling the story just from a different or hidden perspective to give them courage, to give them warning. That last question is one that starts to haunt me. Who can make war against him? Who can make war against him? Down to verse 7. He was given power to make war against the saints, to conquer them, and he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship him, all whose names have not been written in the book of life, belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. John is telling the story from a different perspective or a hidden perspective to give meaning to their life. He's saying, you all are in this wilderness time. You all are in this barren time. You all know what it's like to be living your lives in opposition to those who seem to be infatuated with those that you know are doing unjust things. John is describing what their reality really is. Maybe you can identify with it whenever you think back to a situation or a story or a scenario where it just seemed like there was conflict and you didn't know where it came from. It's like, you couldn't get on the same page. There's just never getting along with the person, and you would say one thing and they would hear another. They would say one thing, you would hear another. It was just this sown conflict over and over and over again. John is describing, saying that's what's going on in our world. Remember these three comings of Christ. First in history at Christmas, and to come in the future. Well, we are right in between them. And John says it's a war zone. It's a war zone. We are living in a time and season where the enemy, the dragon, the serpent, is mad and enraged at his defeat. And he's trying to take it out on us. In fact, he's been trying to take it out on Christians all the way through history. He takes it out on Christians by empowering these beastly reigns all the way through. And it doesn't matter if it's a political ruler, like a president or a prime minister. It doesn't matter if it's a principal of a school, or it doesn't matter if it's a parent who's misguided and takes too much authority or acts in abuse. Right? That's the enemy filling these authorities with his fury and creating a war zone for us to live in. So what are we talking about peace for? How does peace start to make its way into it? The enemy's rage and fury at being cast down it marks all of our lives. And I want to give 4 ways that I see the enemy taking out his fury on us or captivating this furious war. The enemy, the dragon, the serpent, tells lies, and he is cunning, and he deceives. He implants things that are not true, and he attempts to make us think that they are true. He puts just enough of a lie in something that is true to twist the whole truth. The enemy also squeezes us into a mold. Anytime we have the words in our head that says, well, I know that God would have me live this way, but if I'm going to be successful, I've got to do it mainly God's way, but then a little bit like this as well. I've got to do things in the way that the real world does them. I got to live out in the real world, right? That's the enemy acting and placing us as under his thumb in a war zone. The enemy lies to us. He deceives us. He squeezes us into his mold. The enemy overwhelms us bit by bit by bit by bit. How strange that in a season whenever we are preparing to hear the good news of Christ that has brought good news and peace, that we can get overwhelmed bit by bit by bit. Anybody else feel like Christmas can be an overwhelming season? Right? That's the enemy putting bit by bit by bit by bit, slowly overwhelming us. And the 4th way that the enemy engages in this war with us is through unforgiveness. The enemy is so mad and enraged at his own defeat that he finds ways that we have been genuinely hurt, and he just slowly and consistently picks at them and provokes them. That little uprising that you get in your stomach whenever somebody else comes in the room that you know did you wrong last week, last month, last year, last decade. And he picks at that wound over and over and over again. It's like he puts it under a microscope, and he wants us to see it bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes it's not a wound that somebody else has given to us. Sometimes it's a wound that we've inflicted on ourselves or that we've inflicted on somebody else. And the enemy picks at that over and over and over and over again. He expands our wounds. He sows unforgiveness. That's how the enemy fights. Do you remember the question that John asked in it? He said, who can wage war against him? Who can wage war against him? In the text, it's actually people are overwhelmed at the power and strength. Who can wage war? Who could ever bring war against the beast? But we can also ask this question as believers whenever we just get tired of fighting the enemy. Whenever we get tired of being in a war zone. And so we can recognize cunning and deception and lies, but we then just mix in a bit of our own truth and say, well, if I just believe enough of the truth, then I can accept a whole lot of the other lies. One that is so prevalent in our society today, well, God just wants me to be happy. God just wants me to be happy, and so I can do that which makes me happy. It doesn't matter what the other consequences will be. God just wants me to be happy is true. It's just mixed with a bit of the lie. Sometimes that lie is caught with the word just, as though happiness was something small and shriveled up. No, God does desire for us to be happy, but his vision of happiness and joy is great and cosmic and expansive. We settle for too little happiness, and it turns so often to misery. Sometimes whenever we are worn down in this war zone fighting the enemy, we can accept the enemy's parameters and say, yeah, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I need to do it just a little bit. Right? I know I'm supposed to be honest and clear and truthful, but if I can just say something it's kind of the truth, but it will make them think something that's not quite true, that's okay. And we give in. We let the enemy shrink us into his parameters. We can say yes and yes and yes to good things. Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do the other thing? Yes, yes, yes. And we're saying yes to good things, but not to God. And we never stop to say, God, is it you who's asking me to do this? Or is it somebody else that I want to impress? God, is it you that's guiding me into this way of life? Or am I following some other way that isn't bad. It's just not the one you have for me. The enemy can overwhelm us in doing good things if God is not in them. We can grow weary fighting the enemy and just say yes and yes and yes. We grow weary fighting the enemy and we practice unforgiveness. We don't forgive others and we don't forgive ourselves. We hold grudges against our own past selves and we hold grudges against others. All of these are ways that we grow tired in a war zone, that we grow tired fighting the enemy. We have this idea that something is like, if I just give in to the enemy a little bit, he will finally leave me alone. If I just mix in a little bit of truth, if I just hold a bit of a grudge, if I just say yes to one more thing that, well, God's not really in it, but I should probably say yes to it as well. If I just give in a little bit, the enemy will finally leave me alone and I will have some peace. Friends, here's the truth. The enemy is bent on war. He is filled with rage and fury. He has turned the wilderness in which we are still currently living into a war zone, and it won't be changed by us giving in to him. The enemy never leaves us alone because we give in to him even a little bit. Once that little bit is grasped, then he keeps on going. Here's what C.S. Lewis said of it. He said, "We are living in enemy-occupied territory." This is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say, landed in disguise and is calling us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. 3 comings of Christ we mentioned. First was in history, and the third is the one that is to come in his glory and majesty that we anticipate. And yet Christ still comes to us in this war zone time by his Holy Spirit. See, Christ's coming for the first time in history is what created the war zone that we're in because of the enemy's fury. But it's also what gives us peace in the time because Jesus, the Father and the Son have sent the Spirit. And Christ still comes to you, to you, to you, to you, to you, to you moment by moment by his Holy Spirit to strengthen you and refresh you, to give you power to act in ways that sabotage the enemy's plans in this current war zone. How does Jesus fight? He fights with the truth. Unflinching, unyielding commitment to what's true. He doesn't squeeze us into a mold. He opens us up and renews our minds so that we are not squeezed down and shriveled up, but so that our very selves are expanded and we become so much more than what we knew we could be because his very Spirit's within us. Jesus fights the saying yes over and over and over and over and over again, getting overwhelmed, the enemy's tactic. Jesus empowers us by saying, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Like we're thinking about, well, what does Jesus want? He says it's very easy. I want everything. The devil and Jesus are alike in this. They both want it all. They both want it all. Just the enemy's way of taking it all from us is like death by 1,000 cuts. And Jesus' way of receiving all from us is to receive all the burdens so that we can grow up, not be overwhelmed, but be grown up and filled up and expanded. How does Jesus fight? By forgiveness, by forgiving us. Forgiving us the ways that we gave into the enemy. Forgiving us the ways that we gave into the enemy and it harmed ourselves, or forgiving us the ways that we gave in and it harmed others, and then calling us to forgive others. There is no place to hold on to just a bit of unforgiveness. There's no place to hold on to just a little bit of bitterness or a little bit of cynicism. There's no place for us to hold on to just a little bit of the enemy's wartime tactics. No, says Jesus, it's forgiveness. Forgiving others, forgiving ourselves. When we recognize that Christ's coming in history cast the enemy down and created the war zone that we're in, but he promises to come with us moment by moment, we can apply the good news of Jesus to our lives. How? We invite Christ in. We invite Christ in. The moment of temptation comes, it's just that snap of the finger, Jesus, be with me in this moment. The enemy stirs up that strife and that controversy, stirs up that wound, that hurt. Jesus, come and be with me. Remind me of the forgiveness I've received. Give me the strength to forgive another. Invite Christ in. You have a sense of obligation to say yes and yes and yes. Jesus, is this from you or is this not from you? Give me wisdom. Give me clarity, right? Just invite Christ in. Lord, come to my aid. Help me now. If you do this, if you intentionally invite Christ into every one of those moments of temptation, he will meet you in it. He will be there for you. That's the coming that he brings by his Holy Spirit over and over and over again. He will always bring peace, and it will always cost you. What will it cost you? Self-righteousness. What will it cost you? Boosted ego, that you're a person that can just do everything. What will it cost you? Cost you the bit of a high that you get with lust and anger. It'll always cost you. But it will be Christ's peace that comes to you. I love how John ends this story. Skipping down to Revelation 13, the latter part of verse 10, he says this, right? Describing this war zone that we're in and the ups and downs and the defeats even that we'll experience. John says this, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Patient endurance and faithfulness. Patient endurance. It means we're going to have to live out in this war zone and live out in this war zone and live out in this war zone. Patient endurance and faithfulness, right? From the big things down to the small things. Here's how Lewis describes the war zone and the small choices that we make bit by bit. He says this, good and evil both increase at compound interest. In other words, they build on each other, right? They get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. Friends, whenever that bit of envy or angst or hurt or bitterness rolls up within you and you say, Jesus, come on in, remind me of the forgiveness. Give me your peace. Right? You do that bit by bit by bit. It's growing you up into be a person who can do something even greater. Victories you never dreamed of. Listen to the flip side of the coin. Lewis says, an apparently trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or railway line or bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack, otherwise impossible. Friends, what does it take living out in a war zone? Patient endurance and faithfulness. Patient endurance and faithfulness. So how can we put it into play? Number one, stop doing the enemy's bidding. Stop doing the enemy's bidding. When you know something is not quite true, don't believe it. Set it aside. Reject the whole thing. When you know that he's tempting you to engage in unforgiveness again, say, Jesus, come on in. Remind me of the forgiveness I've received and help me to extend forgiveness to others. Whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, invite the peace of Christ. Jesus, what would you have me say no to? What can I discard to live into your peace, even if it means my ego takes a hit? Stop doing the enemy's bidding. Stop thinking that if you give in just a little bit to the enemy, he's going to leave you alone. He never will. You're in a war zone. Not just stop doing the enemy's bidding, but do what you're already doing in profound faith, knowing that you're in a great fight, knowing that you're in a great battle. What do I mean by that? Well, whenever you say grace before meals, remind yourself we're giving thanks to God for providing for us. Do it in great faith. Whenever you come to church, be reminded that you're gathering with your compatriots. You're gathering with your fellow soldiers. You're gathering with others who are in the war with you. Look around and see them in faith as God's people, called, holy and dearly loved and engaged in a great battle. Whenever you read Scripture, don't just read through it to say, oh, check it off my list. Like, no, God, I am engaging in conversation with you so that you can fill me up, so that you can strengthen me for the war I'm about to step into. Right? Do what you're already doing. It's not that you have to add more things. Now, maybe God says, I want you to start doing something. And if God says to start doing something, then do it. Maybe you don't need to start doing more things or start doing new things. Maybe you just need to be reminded of the things that you're already doing and do them in great faith. This really matters. Telling the truth really matters. Saying I'm sorry really matters. Saying I forgive you really matters. Saying I'm going to be there in 5 minutes and being there in 5 minutes really matters. Doing things in great faith. And God will make us into the people who are able to live in this war zone with patient endurance and faithfulness.